The call lasted 47 seconds. Lee Junhyuk stood in the middle of a Tokyo boardroom, surrounded by executives waiting for his signature, and listened to the voice of a stranger tell him that his wife had not boarded her flight, that her phone had been disconnected, that her luggage was still at the guest house where she had been staying in Dawa. He set the pen down. "Get the plane ready," he said quietly. No one in that room had ever seen Junhyuk's hands shake. They were shaking now. Mireille Alexander Lee had been gone for 3 days before anyone admitted something was wrong. That was the first wound. Not the disappearance itself, but the silence surrounding it. His assistant had been told she was resting. His security team had been reassured she had requested privacy. By the time the truth began to surface, 3 days had been swallowed whole, and the woman Junhyuk loved more than the empire he was born to inherit had vanished into a country that should have been her sanctuary. Ethiopia had been her home. Always. He had met Mireille 3 years earlier at a trade negotiation in Washington. She had been the lead attorney for a coalition of international firms, and she had dismantled his legal team's position in under 2 hours. He remembered the moment she stood, 5'9", deep brown skin that held the light like polished obsidian, her natural hair framing her face with the kind of effortless dignity that suggested she had never once doubted herself in a room full of people who expected her to. She had been born in Addis Ababa, educated at one of Ethiopia's most prestigious law institutions, then sharpened further at a Washington postgraduate program until she became the kind of attorney whose name preceded her into every room. Her voice in that negotiation was precise. Her eyes were sharper. When the session broke, Junhyuk had crossed the room and said the only honest thing available to him. "You just cost me $3 million. Will you have dinner with me?" She had tilted her head slightly and said, "You can afford it." They were married 14 months later. Seoul had not been kind to her. That was the careful way of putting it. The honest way was this. From the evening his family first sat across the table from Mireille, the air in every room she entered dropped by several degrees. His mother maintained the polished composure of a woman trained since childhood never to say directly what she meant. His uncle smiled and spoke in rapid Korean, assuming she wouldn't follow. She followed every word. His cousins were indifferent, which was almost merciful. But his sister, Kang Seo-yeon, was none of those things. Seo-yeon was 41, unmarried, and had spent the last decade positioning herself as the invisible spine of the Lee family business empire. She had no official title that reflected her actual authority, and she preferred it that way. She was the kind of woman who understood that real power is never announced. She had survived 3 different chairmen, her grandfather, then her father, and soon, she had calculated, her brother, by making herself indispensable and dangerous in equal measure. The night of the engagement dinner, while their mother offered a practice toast, Seo-yeon had leaned toward Mireille and said 4 words beneath the sound of applause. "You won't last here." Mireille had lifted her glass and smiled. "Watch me." What Seo-yeon had not anticipated was that Mireille meant it. For 2 years, Mireille studied Korean until she no longer needed a translator. She navigated Seoul's social architecture with the same methodical intelligence she applied in courtrooms. She made allies where Seo-yeon expected her to make enemies. She sat through board meetings she had not been invited to and asked questions that exposed gaps no one else had dared to name. She carried herself with the unshakable composure of a woman whose country had never bowed to anyone, and Seoul felt that in her bones. She was not trying to take anything. She was simply refusing to be invisible. That refusal was her crime, in Seo-yeon's eyes. The trap had been constructed carefully, over several months, in the way that only someone with patience and resources and something to protect could construct it. When Mireille's aunt in Addis Ababa fell ill, it was Seo-yeon who gently encouraged her to go. "Of course you should be with your family. We will manage here." When Junhyuk's emergency board crisis in Tokyo was escalated to the point where he could not leave, Seo-yeon had been the one who escalated it. She had thought of everything. Mireille had flown into Addis Ababa first, spent 2 days with her aunt, and then traveled east to Dawa to handle a property matter for a family friend. A trip that had been quietly arranged by people she trusted, who had been paid to arrange it. By the time she arrived, a fabricated legal dispute had been filed against her name in a local civil court. A fraudulent contract tied to a land transaction she had never been part of. Her accounts were flagged. Her passport was held under administrative review. The lawyer she called for help had been paid in advance to stall. Every door had been locked before she reached it. On the third night, two men she had never seen before knocked on the door of her guest house and told her she needed to come with them for a legal consultation. She went because she believed she was still operating within a world that had rules. She would not make that mistake again. Back in Seoul, the story was already being written without her. A single anonymous source had briefed 3 media outlets simultaneously. By morning, the headlines had been translated into 4 languages. The foreign wife who left. Did she marry for money? Lee family crisis as chairman's wife disappears. The photographs they used were selected carefully. Images where Mireille looked unfamiliar, distant, easy to doubt. Jun Hyuk landed in Addis Ababa and drove directly to Dire Dawa. He stood in the empty guesthouse room and looked at her luggage, her books, the half-finished glass of water on the nightstand, and understood with absolute clarity that his wife had not left. She had been taken. He called his head of security and gave one instruction. Find her. Everything else stops. The compound was an hour outside Dire Dawa, set back from a road that cut through dry, rocky terrain with no landmarks worth naming. It belonged, on paper, to a logistics consulting firm registered in Singapore. That firm was owned by a holding company in the Netherlands. That holding company traced back, after 3 layers of deliberate obfuscation, to a woman in Seoul who had never once put her own name on anything she didn't want found. Mireille had understood within the first hour where she was. She had also understood that panic would cost her everything. So she did not panic. She sat in the room they gave her, assessed what she had, her mind, her training, her memory, and made a decision that would take weeks to execute and ultimately cost Seo Yun everything she had built. She began to document. There were 2 guards. They changed shifts on a fixed schedule. The man who brought her meals was talkative in the way that people become when they feel guilty but lack the courage to act on it. His name was Solomon. She learned that on the 2nd day. By the 5th day, he had told her more than he realized. The name of the company that issued his payments, the name of the woman who had called to confirm the arrangement, the fact that he had been told she was a flight risk in an ongoing civil case and that the arrangement was entirely legal. Is that what they told you? Mireille had said, her voice calm, her dark eyes holding his without anger. He hadn't answered. But the following morning, he left his personal phone on the table for 4 minutes when he stepped outside to take a call. 4 minutes was enough. She photographed every document in the room. She accessed a dormant email account she had memorized from a Washington case 2 years earlier. Untraceable, belonging to a legal colleague she trusted completely. She embedded everything into 3 separate emails and sent them before the screen had time to dim. Then she deleted the sent folder, cleared the history, and placed the phone exactly where Solomon had left it. When he returned, she was reading the book she had requested on her 2nd day. He looked at the phone, then at her. Then he picked it up and left without a word. She exhaled once, slowly. Then she turned the page. Jun Hyuk's investigators found the first real thread 11 days in. A payment significant, routed through 4 accounts but not carefully enough, from one of Seo Yun's known business associates to the Singapore firm. It was thin. It would not hold in court alone. But it was enough to pull. They pulled. What unraveled over the following days was not simply the evidence of Mireille's captivity. It was the evidence of years. Secret commissions on company contracts funneled to Seo Yun's private network. Supplier agreements signed without board approval. An entire shadow operation running beneath the family company's official structure. Feeding a fortune Seo Yun had been quietly building since their father's last illness had left governance momentarily unsupervised. She had stolen from her own family with the precision of someone who had always believed she deserved more than anyone else. And Mireille had seen the edge of it during a routine contract review 8 months earlier. She had flagged an irregularity to Jun Hyuk casually, over dinner. She hadn't known what she was looking at yet, but Seo Yun had known that she had looked. That was why the trap had been built. Not jealousy alone. Fear. Jun Hyuk sat with that knowledge for a long time in the back of an unmarked vehicle outside the compound where his wife was being held. His security team had confirmed she was inside. They had confirmed she was unharmed. They were waiting for his instruction. He thought about his sister. He thought about every family dinner, every board meeting, every holiday photograph. He thought about how much of what he had believed about her had been a performance staged specifically for him. "Get her out," he said. His team moved. Mireille was standing by the window when the door opened. She turned and saw her husband. He looked like he had not slept in 11 days, which was accurate. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was holding something massive and terrible very still inside himself. She crossed the room. He held her. Neither of them spoke for nearly a full minute. Then Mireille stepped back, and he saw her eyes. Clear, sharp, not broken. Not even close to broken. She reached into the interior pocket of the jacket Solomon had, in the end, quietly given her, and produced a folded set of papers covered in her own handwriting. "I need a secure scanner," she said, "and a lawyer who has never worked for your family." He almost smiled. "I married a terrifying woman." "You married the right one," she said. "Now let's finish this." The drive back to Addis Ababa was quiet. Jun Hyuk sat close to her and said nothing, because there were things that did not need to be said in that moment and things that could not yet be said without the weight of what was coming pressing them flat. She rested her head against his shoulder for a long stretch of road. Red dust rising outside the windows, the Ethiopian highlands opening wide around them. And then she sat up and began dictating names and figures to his assistant from memory. In Seoul, Seo Yun was attending a board dinner. She had already begun moving pieces into position for the next phase of her consolidation. With Mireille discredited and Jun Hyuk destabilized, the window was open. She just needed a few more weeks. Her personal phone buzzed beneath the table. She glanced at it. A name she had not expected to see. A message that was only 4 words long. "We need to talk." It was from Solomon. She kept her expression exactly as it was. She lifted her wine glass. She laughed at something someone said across the table. But her hand, beneath the linen, pressed flat against her thigh. And for the first time in many years, Kang So-yun felt something she had not planned for. The lawsuit was filed on a Monday morning in Seoul, simultaneously with a companion filing in an Ethiopian federal court. By afternoon, it had been picked up by 14 international news agencies. By evening, it had broken through into the kind of coverage that money and connections cannot fully suppress. The kind that arrives when the documents are too specific, the witnesses too numerous, and the story too extraordinary to contain. The headline that traveled the furthest was a simple one. Korean heiress accused of orchestrating Ethiopian attorney's abduction in cross-border conspiracy. Seo Yun's attorneys issued a statement within hours. It was measured, confident, and described the allegations as a fabricated assault on a grieving family by a foreign national with a financial motive. They called Mireille manipulative. They called Jun Hyuk misled. They invoked the family name with the gravity of something sacred and above suspicion. It was an excellent statement. It would not survive contact with what Mireille had. The morning proceedings began. Mireille arrived in a deep burgundy suit, her natural hair framing her face in soft, deliberate volume. Her posture carrying the quiet authority of a woman whose country had stood unbowed for 3,000 years. She moved through the courthouse the way she moved through every room, like she had already read the ending. Jun Hyuk walked beside her. He had declined the seat reserved for family observers and instead sat directly beside her legal team. Seo Yun was already inside. She wore gray, the color of someone who understood optics, flanked by 4 attorneys and an expression that communicated boredom, which was the most dangerous expression she owned. She did not look at Mireille when she entered. Mireille did not look at her either. The first 3 days of proceedings were devoted to Seo Yun's defense. Her attorneys were formidable. They attacked the origin of every document, questioned the chain of custody on financial records, and worked methodically to characterize Mireille as an ambitious outsider who had inserted herself into a vulnerable family and manufactured a crisis for personal gain. It was a coherent argument. In a different case, against a different opponent, it might have worked. Then the witnesses began. Solomon testified on the 4th day. He was not a dramatic witness. He spoke quietly, precisely, and described in specific detail the instructions he had received, the payments he had been made, and the name of the woman who had called him personally to confirm the arrangement. He had the call log. He had the voicemail, which he had kept, he said, because something had told him he might need it. Seo Yun's lead attorney objected repeatedly during his testimony. Several objections were sustained. The ones that were not each landed like something structural giving way. A former company accountant testified on the 6th day. She had been quietly removed from her position 18 months prior under circumstances she had always found suspicious. She brought records she had copied before her access was revoked. Not because she had planned to use them, but because she had wanted to understand what she had been part of. The financial irregularities she described were not minor. The judge asked 3 clarifying questions, which was unusual. On the 8th day, the audio recordings were admitted. There were 6 of them. Phone conversations between Seo-yun and her primary associate, discussing the Dire Dawa arrangement in terms that left very little room for interpretation. In one recording, Seo-yun's voice was crisp and specific. "She cannot come back before the board vote. I don't care how it's managed. I just need 60 more days." The courtroom did not erupt. There was no audible gasp. The judge maintained order. But the quality of silence that followed the playing of that recording was the kind that settles into a room and does not leave. Seo-yun's expression did not change. It was her greatest performance and her final one. The defense argued the recordings were improperly obtained. That challenge occupied 2 full days and was ultimately rejected. Mirai's legal team had spent 3 weeks ensuring the foundation was airtight. Jun-hyuk testified on the 11th day. He spoke without notes. He described the timeline with the measured delivery of someone who had rehearsed nothing because he did not need to rehearse the truth. When asked what he had thought when he first saw the headlines calling his wife a flight risk, he paused for a moment. "I thought someone had severely underestimated her," he said, "and that they would regret it." In the gallery, someone exhaled. Then the final piece arrived, not through the courtroom, but through investigators who had continued working while the trial was in session. 14 years earlier, a business partner of the Lee family patriarch had been removed from a joint venture following a financial scandal. That man had spent over a decade in legal disputes attempting to clear his name. A company employee had been criminally charged in connection with the incident and had served prison time before a quiet settlement buried most of the facts. Both men were still alive. Both had been contacted. Both could testify that the evidence used against them had been fabricated. And both, through documents preserved for over a decade in the hope that someday they would matter, could trace that fabrication back to a 27-year-old internal auditor at the Lee family company. Seo-yun had been 27. Her attorneys met with her privately that evening. The following morning, they requested a continuance. It was denied. The verdict came on a gray soul morning, not a significant day by any design, simply the day the evidence finished speaking. Kang Seo-yun was found liable on every civil count. Criminal referrals were filed the same afternoon, covering the Dire Dawa arrangement, the financial crimes spanning nearly a decade, and the evidence tampering from 14 years prior. Her assets were frozen before she left the building. The position she held, informal, powerful, deeply embedded in the company's internal structure, was dissolved by emergency board resolution the following morning. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. She walked out of the courthouse in the gray suit, flanked by attorneys who were already calculating what they could and could not salvage. The woman who had spent 40 years engineering every room she entered left through a side exit without a word. The businessman she had destroyed 14 years earlier was waiting outside the main entrance with his family. Not for her. Simply to be present on the day the record was corrected. He stood in the morning light with his wife and his grown son and said nothing dramatic. That image, quiet, patient, dignified, traveled farther than any courtroom photograph. Jun-hyuk and Mirai did not celebrate. That evening they sat in their sole apartment, and Mirai made tea the way her mother had taught her in Addis Ababa. Standing at the stove, unhurried, the steam rising slow and steady. Jun-hyuk sat at the kitchen table and watched her and thought about all the versions of this year that could have ended differently. All the moments where a different woman would have accepted the exit offered to her. The settlement, the quiet withdrawal, the decision to let it go in exchange for peace. Mirai had never once considered it. She set the cup in front of him and sat down. She looked tired in a way she rarely allowed him to see, the kind of tired that lives beneath precision, the weight of having held everything together through sheer refusal to release it. Then, from the bedroom came the sound of small feet hitting the floor. Saren Lee appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, 3 years old, with her mother's deep brown skin and her father's sharp eyes, her hair in 2 unraveling puffs from where she had slept on them. She stood surveying the kitchen with the serious expression she reserved for situations she had not been consulted about. Then she walked directly to her mother, climbed into her lap without asking, and pressed her small face against Mireille's collarbone with the absolute confidence of a child who had never once doubted her welcome. Mireille's arms closed around her. Something in her face shifted, the last held thing releasing, finally, completely. She pressed her lips to the top of Saren's head and closed her eyes for a moment. And Junhyuk watched his wife and his daughter and felt the specific gratitude of a man who had almost learned too late what he was fighting for. Appa, Saren said without lifting her head, addressing Junhyuk with the Korean word for father that she had decided, several months prior, was simply his name. Yes, he said. I'm hungry. Mireille laughed. Quiet and real, the kind that surprises a person. Junhyuk stood up to find something in the kitchen, and in that ordinary moment, something that had been compressed for nearly a year began, slowly, to breathe again. They left Seoul 6 weeks later. Junhyuk resigned from the family company in a letter that said everything that needed to be said without theatrics. He had already begun building a new international venture. No legacy obligations, no inherited architecture, nothing built on the foundation of what his family had become. Mireille had accepted a position with an international law firm with offices in Washington and Addis Ababa. They flew home to Ethiopia on a clear morning. Mireille's aunt was waiting at Bole International Airport. A small, composed woman with Mireille's same sharp eyes and the unhurried bearing of someone who had raised a girl to be unbreakable. She held Mireille without speaking, the way people hold each other when words are simply not the right instrument. Junhyuk stood to the side with Saren on his hip. Saren studied her great-aunt with enormous seriousness, then reached out and patted her cheek once, gently, as though conferring approval. The old woman laughed and took her immediately. The foundation came 6 months later. It was Mireille's idea, as most consequential things in their life had become. A scholarship and legal aid organization supporting multicultural families navigating discrimination in professional and immigration spaces, built precisely from the architecture of harm that had nearly dismantled her own life. They launched quietly, without fanfare, and the first recipients were selected before the press release was written. At the inaugural public event, held in a sunlit hall in Addis Ababa, Junhyuk stood beside Mireille and watched her speak to a room of young people with the same unbroken clarity that had first stopped him mid-sentence in a Washington conference room years before. Saren sat in the front row between 2 foundation staff members, wearing a yellow dress she had selected herself and eating a biscuit with great concentration, occasionally looking up at her mother with an expression of calm pride that was almost comically adult for a 3-year-old. Afterward, a young woman approached Mireille and asked how she had held herself together when everything was being taken from her. Mireille considered the question the way she considered everything, fully, without rushing. I knew who I was, she said. They didn't. That's the only advantage that ever truly matters. Outside, as they walked to the car through warm Addis Ababa air, Junhyuk took Mireille's hand. Saren walked between them, holding a finger from each parent, lifting her feet dramatically over cracks in the pavement with the grave focus of someone navigating a complex obstacle course. At some point she stopped, looked up at her mother, then her father, then back at her mother. Again, she said, which was her current instruction for being swung between them. They swung her. She shrieked with delight. A woman passing smiled without knowing why. Mireille looked at her daughter, this small, fearless, entirely certain person who had arrived into a storm and known nothing of it, and then at the road stretching ahead of them. They tried to erase our family, she said. Junhyuk lifted Saren onto his shoulders. The little girl grabbed his hair with both fists and looked out at the city of her mother's birth like she was surveying something that belonged to her. Instead, he said, they made us permanent. The afternoon light fell gold across Addis Ababa. Unhurried, undefeated, entirely theirs. If the story held you from the very first second, you already know what to do. Like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. When did you know Mireille was going to win? Was it the phone? The courtroom? Or did you know from the moment she lifted that glass and said, "Watch me"?